Good evening, everyone. Um, my name is Stephanie Rupp, and I'm not sure actually if you can see me because I cannot see myself on the Zoom. So I may be like a voice from the netherworld, which is fine. It is my great honor to introduce our speakers for this evening, April Nowell and Kathleen Sterling. I would like to give you an overview of our distinguished lecture series. This is the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences, and this is our distinguished lecture series for 2021-22. Our theme is emergent care and community. Kathleen, could you just give me a thumbs up if my video is visible to you? It is? Okay, thank you, April. I would like to introduce our audience to our theme for this year, Emergent Care and Community, and to let everyone know that we've invited Kathleen Sterling to deliver a lecture on this theme, and April Nowell will be presenting the comments. And we are so grateful to both of you for your participation. In the wake of our turbulent and abiding experiences of pandemic pain and politics, the Anthropology section of the New York Academy of Sciences will focus our 2021-22 program on theory and critique of forms of care, mutual aid, and charity. With this theme, we raise questions about possibility and solidarity in the face of entrenched social iniquities and racialized structural violence. With this theme, we honor 4 esteemed colleagues from our anthropology community whom we recently lost: David Graeber, Sally Engel-Mary, Leith Mullings, and Paul Farmer. We invite discussion of how communities develop and deepen forms of care for one another and our environment in times of crisis or under enduring conditions of suffering. How might care be reactive, adaptive, relative, and revelatory? How do emergent communities, both on the ground and in virtual spaces, stake claims to a future that expands or contracts in the space of solidarity? This conversation invites discussion of the politics of humanitarian efforts throughout the world in recognition of the reality that much community-based care emerges in the shadow of dysfunctional governance and the corruptions of neoliberalism. The global pandemic has highlighted the irony that care workers are often underpaid or even unpaid, their exploitation a symptom of structural inequalities accrued across generations. Against the centrifugal forces of capitalist modernity, what possibilities exist for radical mutuality in the future? What constitutes care as related to the social, environmental, ontological, or material? Rather than asking anthropologists to assume some kind of prophetic role, this series offers an opportunity to take critical stock of what tools and perspectives our discipline provides in terms of methods, theory, community engagement, and public commentary as we envision and imagine new possibilities for reshaping society. We are mindful of the crisis of Ukraine and in Eastern Europe, recognizing that this is an urgent iteration of imperial criminality that so many communities have suffered at the hands of subjugating powers. We seek to understand and engage forms of care and mutuality that oppose and redress the injustices of all imperialisms, past and present. I will now pass the camera over to Christina Baines, who will introduce our speakers for tonight. Christina?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure that we welcome today Kathleen Sterling. She's an associate professor of anthropology and affiliated faculty in women's gender and sexuality studies at Binghamton University. Her research is centered in the French Pyrenees, where she currently is co-director of the Peyro Blanc, an open-air late Paleolithic site. The project grew out of a long-term pedestrian survey project that has collected thousands of lithic objects spanning the Paleolithic. Her research interests include lithic technology, learning and identity, communities of practice, Paleolithic visual imagery, hunting and gathering groups, gender and feminist science, Black feminist theory, landscape archaeology, and the sociopolitics of archaeology. The themes of her work are connected with dispelling myths about human ancestors as violent, primitive, and limited. She is also concerned with the equal opportunity in anthropology and science in general, particularly in the ways in which this has an impact on knowledge production. And before we turn the mic over to Kathleen to begin her talk, I would just like to introduce April Nowell, who will be the discussant for tonight's talk. April is a Paleolithic archaeologist and professor of anthropology at the University of Victoria. She directs an international team of scientists in the study of lower and middle Paleolithic sites in Jordan and collaborates with colleagues on the study of Ice Age rock art in Australia and France, and on ostrich eggshell beads in South Africa. In 2016, she and her colleagues working in Jordan published the world's oldest identifiable blood-on-stone tools, showing that 250,000 years ago, Middle Pleistocene hominins ate everything from ducks to rhinos. This research was named one of Time magazine's top 100 discoveries, and she's known for her publications on cognitive archaeology, Paleolithic art, the archaeology of children, and the relationship between science, pop culture, and the media. Her co-edited volumes include Stone Tools and the Evolution of Human Cognition, The Archaeology of Night, Life After Dark, in the Ancient World, and the forthcoming Culturing the Body, Prehistoric Perspectives on Identity and Sociality. She's also the author of a new book, Growing Up in the Ice Age, Fossil and Archaeological Evidence of Lived Lives in Pleistocene Children. So with that, I would like to turn the mic over to Professor Sterling to present her research on building Ice Age community through stone. We're very fortunate to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Christina, Stephanie, and everyone at the New York Academy of Sciences. I'm delighted to be with you tonight to talk about this topic. And before I start, there is one image that has human remains on it. It's from a Paleolithic site in Russia, and that's the 13th slide. It will only be up briefly. And I would also like to acknowledge that Binghamton University sits on the traditional unceded lands of the Onondaga people, part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. So we all know the popular picture of cavemen living in the Ice Age. They're dirty, unkempt, and dressed in ragged hides or furs. They have very few possessions in their cave, perhaps a club and a few spears, and there might be a bit of meat on a spit over a small fire. The whole picture is very grim. While anyone who has taken an anthropology class should know that this image is way out of date, it still colors our perceptions of these people as simple and natural. We see what we already believe to be essentially human when we imagine Ice Age cavemen. While I do not believe that we should look to human ancestors for models of basic human behavior, I know that this will happen nonetheless. So it is important to make sure that the stories we tell do not oversimplify or overgeneralize the diversity of Ice Age life. Keeping with the theme of this year's lecture series, I will discuss evidence for community with a focus on the use of stone. Along the way, I will touch on some of the problems I see in how we've created and used the narratives of the deep past. And finally, discuss my ongoing field project in the French Pyrenees, where stone has been used in unusual and creative ways. I want to begin by defining some terms, since there are a number of terms used almost interchangeably, but that refer to different things. The deep past has been divided into 3 ages of very unequal lengths: stone, bronze, and iron. The Stone Age is an incredibly long and diverse period, beginning with our ancestors and close relatives' earliest production and use of stone tools, and ending with early metallurgy, a time span of well over 2 million years when we consider every part of the world that humans have inhabited. As you can imagine, there's also incredible diversity across time and space in the ways that people lived. The term covers so much as to be essentially useless for anthropology, but it is a powerful and typically harmful metaphor in popular culture. The Pleistocene is a geological epoch that covers the advance and retreat of multiple glaciations and is colloquially known as the Ice Age. The Pleistocene fits entirely within the Stone Age, though the Stone Age begins before the Pleistocene in the Pliocene and ends after in the Holocene. The Paleolithic is a cultural designation coined for European prehistory and applied elsewhere unevenly and often uncritically. It refers to the earliest and longest part of the broader Stone Age, and while it translates literally to Old Stone Age, it is not the same as the African Old Stone Age. As usual, we divide the Paleolithic into three parts, lower, middle, and upper, and each of these periods is further divided and each named after French archaeological sites. The cultures of these periods are described as hunter-gatherers or hunter-gatherer-fisherers or foraging societies, focusing on subsistence rather than anything else. For the sake of clarity, I will primarily refer to the focus of my
Audio
research
settings, yes.
as the Magdalenian,
So should I leave
archaeological-
it as real tech?
an archaeological culture toward the end of the Pleistocene in Western Europe. The further we look back in the past, the more we've compressed time and homogenized things. When we talk about the Ice Age or the Stone Age, this comprises all of the varieties of human that have ever lived, along with a vast geographic span with a broad range of climates and landscapes. It should logically follow that past societies were also incredibly diverse. However, our understanding of that diversity is severely limited by the great deal of investment in archaeological research and publication focusing on Europe, as well as an ideology that narrows what we imagine to have been possible for past populations. It is the result of an origins way of thinking, or a simplistic evolutionary perspective. In this model, humanity is constantly making progress, not just technologically, but in other aspects of culture, even if we do not see it as accompanied by biological change or progress. We look to the past several hundred or thousand years, and we see better human health and longevity, greater rights for minoritized groups, and increased protections and entitlements for children. Economies and efficiencies grow, and we see all of this as humanity getting better. The model dictates that if society is better now than the recent past, it stands to reason that it is also much, much better than it was in the distant past. If we have more choices than our parents and grandparents, then surely many generations back, there was very little choice. If we see ourselves as liberated from the vagaries of nature, our distant ancestors were very much subject to them. This creates an image of societies where survival was paramount, and any mistake or inefficiency could be the difference between just scraping by and disaster. The idea of efficiency is the behavioral equivalent of biological fitness. The problem is that efficiency is ill-defined and unevenly applied. So-called efficient behaviors are assumed rather than supported through evidence. This includes a binary gendered division of labor along predictable lines, regardless of time or place, physical aggression, primarily by men towards others, and constant cost-benefit and choices of raw materials, foods, and mobility. Archaeological evidence is shoehorned into this model. The logical gymnastics required are more obvious in cases where material production does not clearly support survival, such as the hours spent creating thousands of ivory beads, painted engraved objects and cave walls, or musical instruments. This reasoning passes under the radar in cases like stone tool production, for example, where the extensive use of distant raw materials when local materials are available must be due to the fact that distant materials were somehow better, or technological traditions are seen as maximizing cutting edges per volume of material, all the while ignoring the abundance of usable discarded material, other than to use that material to recreate the steps in production. Stone tool production certainly provides evidence for us to discuss technology, but we can and should go deeper into what else we can learn from the most abundant material remains from this time. When I was asked to talk about my research in the context of this year's theme of emergent care and community, this theme was so relevant to our present moment. But what did I have to offer as someone studying people so long ago? Especially when I explicitly reject the idea that the distant past teaches us what human nature is. Of course, people lived in groups and worked together, and this was necessary to survive and thrive. But is this enough to describe Ice Age groups as communities? How do we define community? We would not describe a modern extended family or kin group as necessarily constituting a community. So we should not describe groups in the past this way without a good reason. Just as we use the word home to evoke something more emotionally and culturally significant than house or shelter, the word community describes more than just a population that shares a time and place. I would argue that community requires shared goals and ideals, and that community needs to be actively built and maintained. To some extent, people need to choose how and if they belong to a community, and the community has the power to set the parameters for belonging. There are many ways in which this may have occurred, such as teaching traditions through action or storytelling, and sanctioning acts that were inconsistent with the community's values. The difficult part is determining what the archaeological evidence we have can tell us about community. If we are to learn about community in the past, we need to consider how it was mediated materially, and for the deep past, the evidence is likely present in stone materials. For Ice Age Europe, the vast majority of the material culture that preserves is stone, in the form of chipped stone tools, caves and rock shelters, figurines and beads, engraved plaquettes, and other lesser known uses. Most of these categories are analyzed separately, and for those that are considered functional, the technical aspects of production and use are the primary focus, with a consideration of style or other attributes that are harder to measure, given much less importance. For practices seen as non-functional, style and formal analysis are essential, but technical execution still holds an important place. We remain reluctant to go beyond description and so-called rational economic justifications in our discussions of the past. And as long as that remains the case, we won't be able to address interesting social questions. However, for anyone willing to think about cultural choices behind the use of stone, I have a few suggestions of how we might think about community, using some examples from Magdalenian sites in the French Pyrenees. One possibility is thinking about communities of practice. This term is probably familiar, though the original sense has been stretched. A community of practice is a group of people who are connected around a specific activity and share an understanding of that community's knowledge, beliefs, and identity. The members of the community may have differing levels of skill, access, status, and knowledge, all of which may change as the composition of the group changes. Technical traditions have been a fruitful area for archaeologists to investigate communities of practice, since we can often identify repeated sequences of production and see where people made choices. For example, it is fairly easy to create a sharp edge in stone. It takes seconds, and many flakes can be modified into a variety of shapes. However, the stone tool production we see in the Magdalenian is mostly standardized and requires skill. While some people may be able to recreate the tools they see without being taught how to do so, if they have a basic understanding of fracture mechanics, it is much likelier that they learned how to make these tools the quote-unquote right way. This would have involved spending time with people who knew what they were doing, observing, trying, being corrected, and earning approval. There are multiple ways to arrive at the same end result, but when we look at all of the steps to create a stone tool, we see that the same choices were being made over and over during the Middle Magdalenian, within and across archaeological sites. We can ask ourselves who was permitted to join these communities and what else went on while they undertook their activities. How often did smaller communities get together to share knowledge and reinforce their sense of community? When we see change over time, such as later in the Magdalenian, when people were less predictable about the steps they took in stone tool production, does this reflect a weakening or even a disappearance of this community of practice? We can also consider the sources of raw materials that are shared across sites, sometimes quite distant from each other. Chert, the broad category of stone preferred for making chipped stone tools, is abundant in Western Europe. Yet we find that people carried cobbles of stone, not just tools, sometimes hundreds of kilometers, when there is serviceable raw material much closer to the sites where the objects and the waste of their manufacture ended up. We don't know whether the material was traded or brought directly to the sites by the people who used them, but either way, human hands and feet bear responsibility for the presence of the stone where we recover it. The rational economic explanations emphasize the quality of the raw materials, such as their fine crystalline structure, or the size of the cobbles, or the low level of flaws. However, we also find that people made more or less the exact same tools with local materials as distant, and sometimes chose raw materials that were typically flawed, brittle, or contained inclusions. Knappers had the skill to produce what they desired from a broad range of stone, so was it truly efficient to carry the extra weight? Perhaps another explanation fits better, at least for the central French Pyrenees. The distant raw materials that come from the north and the west are visually distinctive, with colors, luster, and inclusions, unlike most of the local materials. There are also a few local materials that are regularly present in small amounts in this region, in every site, despite the fact that the natural cobbles are typically on the small side, and the material has inclusions and irregularities. However, like this distant material, it is visually distinctive. If many of these materials are visually distinct to our modern eyes, imagine how quickly and easily they were distinguishable for people who saw and used them every day. Beyond the aesthetic qualities of the materials, they come from specific places in the landscape and may have been associated with those places or with other communities. The curation of these objects in people's toolkits connected them to people within and beyond their immediate group, and may have represented bonds with an extended or distributed community. The last example I want to present is the site my team is currently investigating, Peyro Blanc. The site was discovered in the context of a long-term regional survey project started by Meg Conkey in the early 1990s called Between the Caves. The archaeology of Paleolithic Western Europe was then, and largely still is, dominated by the archaeology of caves. Conkey set out to demonstrate that long-term Pleistocene human presence in the open air was visible, if only we looked for it. Our particular interest was in Upper Paleolithic use of the landscape. So after many years of survey, we began to excavate test units to understand the relationship between surface finds and the possibility of preserved archaeological levels underground. The early test units did not result in intact Upper Paleolithic levels, but they did confirm some of the geological observations we made, particularly reinforcing an Upper Paleolithic preference for sandy sediments and relatively higher elevations. All the while, we continued to survey plowed fields, especially fields that we had not surveyed before and those associated with sandy sediments. At one point, we followed a trail into the woods where we found a plowed field filled with Upper Paleolithic objects. We continued to follow that trail uphill and found that on top of a crest in a spot called Peyro Blanc, there were many lithic artifacts eroding out of the trail. It's a public hiking trail, so it gets a lot of disturbance by the passage of hikers, horseback riders, and motorcycles, and it's a very sandy trail. but the sediments next to the trail were considerably less disturbed. Most of the lithics were flakes, but there were enough diagnostic objects such as end scrapers, figurines, blades, and bladelets that we were able to determine that there was an Upper Paleolithic presence and likely a Magdalenian presence. This time, when we excavated test units, we found that there was what appeared to be a single intact and very rich archaeological level, and we arranged to open a broader horizontal exposure the following year. Over the next several years, we continually broadened the excavation. The open air setting meant there were some challenges that are not as problematic in caves and rock shelters, most notably preservation. The sediment is acidic, and because the site is on top of the ridge, there's a low level of sediment creation, meaning that the archaeological level is not deeply buried. Organics are almost completely absent, and we rely heavily on stone to interpret the site. Because of the state of organic preservation at Peyro Blanc, radiocarbon dating has not been possible. We sought out a date through optically stimulated luminescence dating, which determines when quartz grains in a soil sample were last exposed to light. We obtained a date of about 17,000 years, which would date the site to the early Middle Magdalenian, shortly after the last glacial maximum. This date is in fact a bit young due to the low rate of sedimentation. We also sought out stone tool assemblages elsewhere for comparison and found the most similar assemblages in cave sites in Cantabria, dated to the early Middle Magdalenian around 18 to 19,000 years ago. Turning briefly to the lithic assemblage, I will describe and highlight some of the interesting aspects. One of the first things to note is the high percentage of objects made of local raw material. The site is located approximately 300 meters upslope from a good quality lithic source, and nearly 80% of the raw material is from this source or one that is geologically similar, with another 10% or so coming from another source of about 40 kilometers away. The most distant materials, the remaining 10%, come from the Béarn and the Dordogne, about 150 and 200 kilometers away, respectively. This is completely different from Middle Magdalenian cave assemblages in the Central Pyrenees, where the majority of raw materials, for example, around 65% at Amlen, typically come from the same distant sources. Another distinctive aspect of the lithic assemblage at Peyro Blanc is the presence of complete chaîne opératoire compared to cave sites that are usually lacking at the earliest stages of core reduction, even in the case of local raw materials. This is clear in the case of the chert collected from the nearby source, but also for other types of chert collected from the broader region. The most distant material, however, is mostly represented by what we would call formal tools, or blades and bladelets, with a few occurrences of bladelet cores, a practice that came common during the later phases of the regional Magdalenian. We also see the production and probably use of tool types we don't find in caves at this time, such as large scrapers, indicating different activities in the open air. The assemblage mostly consists of flaked chert, but the people at Peyro Blanc used other stone in intriguing ways. One example is this quartzite anvil that was deliberately modified in a way that does not affect its function, but reinforces its resemblance to a horse. The top image shows you the back where it was actually used for pounding, and the bottom image shows you where it was modified. So 2 flakes removed here to form the ears, a flake here to shape the underneath the muzzle, and 2 flakes removed here to make the nose. And you can see how that bears a resemblance to the horses that they made deliberately out of horse hyoid bones. The eye is actually natural. Magdalenians are sometimes referred to as reindeer people due to the abundance of reindeer remains in archaeological sites, but I actually prefer to see them as horse people. They painted and engraved horses, decorated objects in cave walls with them, and probably put them on all kinds of things that no longer preserve. So this cobble in its natural state must have been irresistible. Another more dramatic example is the stone structure built out of hundreds of sandstones of 5 different types, some of which occur naturally in the immediate surroundings on top of the ridge, others of which had to be carried uphill to the site. At present, we do not see signs that the individual stones were modified, such as by engraving, as we see in a few cave sites, but the arrangement of the stones is very clearly patterned. With hopes for additional lines of evidence, for example, to possibly recover some organic remains from a sediment context that was less acidic, and to better understand the extent and variation of this site without any walls, we excavated several shovel test pits extending east from the original excavation area. One 30 by 30 centimeter test pit uncovered multiple sandstone slabs that turned out to be part of this extensive stone structure. Over the years, we have excavated an ever greater horizontal exposure, and as of now, it appears that the sandstone structure is at least 10 meters in length. While the entirety of the structure has not yet been fully excavated and its function not understood, it nonetheless stands in sharp contrast to what settlement strategies and practices are known for the wider region. There are many caves and rock shelters nearby, including a couple only meters north of this structure, about 3 meters. Traditionally, there has not been an expectation that hunter-gatherers, especially tens of thousands of years ago, might have created a built environment. Remains such as the so-called mammoth bone structures on the Russian plain and other possible stone arrangements or possible post holes are more often considered as exceptions rather than as an integral part of the upper, much less middle Paleolithic and their cultural practices. Open-air construction during the Ice Age has been assumed to have occurred where caves are unavailable. The open-air site at Peyro Blanc has the potential to change this narrative. As of now, we have identified 5 different types of sandy limestone or sandstone used in the construction, primarily in slabs and of different sizes and shapes. The sand to carbonate ratio varies in the different types, and the crystal size ranges from microcrystalline to macrocrystalline, and some of them are quite friable. Some types are found in only one part of the structure, and there are many small stones, some as small as a golf ball, and irregularly shaped stones that are not obvious choices, at least to us, for building materials. Some of the stone types are extant on top of the ridge, having eroded from the bedrock, which you can see here at the top. But most of the materials appear to have been collected somewhere downslope from where the structure was built. Only 5 of the stones show signs of exposure to fire, 4 of them in close proximity to each other, and 1 over a meter away. The structure runs parallel to the exposed bedrock of the ridge. We believe we are close to the western boundary, which is incompletely buried. The southern boundary has been identified, if not completely excavated. There appears to be a gap of about 2 meters between the north boundary and the bedrock, and the eastern extent remains unclear. Near the center of what is currently exposed, there are 2 clear arrangements of the largest stones, enclosing nearly empty spaces of about 2,500 square centimeters. You can see those here. To the south and west of these arrangements, we find the largest blocks of the structure, some of which are stacked and form an irregular but roughly level surface, with a few blocks that appear to have slid downward and toward the south a few centimeters. At the westernmost exposed area, there are smaller arrangements of stones that might have served to support posts. At the time of occupation, the region would have had extensive permafrost, making digging difficult. To the east of the large stone block arrangement, most of the smaller, irregular stones are found, arranged in a slightly domed ovate shape. So right here. There are more stones to the north and east of this part of the structure, and this is one of the areas where we plan to focus future excavation to better understand the organization of the different zones. Relatively few artifacts have been recovered from the structure. Somewhat more than 1,200 lithic fragments have been recovered from the entirety of the structure, an area of about 50 square meters, which is a quantity that is roughly equal to what is recovered in an average square meter in the rest of the excavation. The greatest density of lithics by far is at the western edge of the structure, with the next highest densities primarily coming from other units on the edge of the structure. Most of the chert recovered is local, either from the source, a source approximately 6 kilometers west along the same ridgetop, or it is consistent with the source approximately 300 meters downslope. However, there is one very heavily used tool that is present, made from chert that comes from about 250 kilometers north, and it is a chert that is commonly found in Middle Magdalenian cave sites in the region. While we have focused on expanding the horizontal exposure of the stones over several seasons, we have also begun to investigate what might lie underneath the stones in a 50 centimeter wide transect in the eastern domed part of the structure, along here. This was the earliest excavated part of the structure and has been thoroughly recorded using photography and photogrammetry linked to total station measurements. Because this part has been exposed the longest, it is at the highest risk of change through bioturbation, primarily through animal activity, and humidity and temperature changes in the soil. We've recovered few artifacts below the stone so far, and surprisingly, what we found is 2 pieces of worked antler and lumps of what appear to be a resin-based adhesive. The antler pieces were shaped and smoothed, and one was grooved. Unfortunately, none of the antler recovered contained enough organic material for AMS radiocarbon dating. Once we're able to resume excavations, we intend to focus on exposing the rest of the structure and continuing the transect into it to better understand its construction and use. While the creation of the structure did not have to be undertaken by a community, I believe there are good reasons to see it in this light. First, there was the effort to bring stones upslope. If a small number of people undertook this task, it must have been supported by the group, as the time spent building was not spent toward other activities. If most or all of the group were involved, the organization of stones, particularly the western part of the structure, is evidence of their cooperation and planning. The eastern part of the structure has a different patterning of stones, and as I mentioned, some of these stones were so small as to be puzzling choices for building. I can't help but imagine that these smaller stones are evidence of the entire community contributing, with even the youngest children carrying stones up the hill and adding them to the dome part of the structure. I hope that this brief overview has challenged the stereotypes of Ice Age European life that you may have heard or held. Rather than the primitive, precarious groups that were barely scraping by until the glaciers retreated and someone could invent agriculture in villages, these people were in no way our inferiors. I have highlighted community rather than competition, built through durable stone, but imagine the ephemera that also contributed to their sense of belonging. Decorated clothing, bags, baskets, and tents, wooden tools and toys, songs and stories. While we cannot look to our ancestors for lessons about how we must be, since we have created the image of our ancestors as pale shadows of ourselves, they do show us a variety of ways people can be, and that cooperation and community were a very successful approach to human life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen, for a very timely and provocative talk. We really appreciate it. We would like to now invite April Nowell to come forward and share some of your thoughts.
Thank you.
They relate to to Kathleen's talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm just going to move my little thing there. Okay. Kathleen, thank you so much for such a fantastic talk. And it's really such a privilege to be joining you here tonight to be able to discuss this idea of Ice Age communities. And when I was reading an earlier version, an earlier draft of your talk, and again tonight listening to you speak, I had a million ideas because you brought out so many interesting points, and I kept thinking, oh, add that to lecture on Upper Paleolithic. So I'm rewriting things as I'm listening to you, and so I just wanted to highlight a few ideas that came to me as I was listening to you tonight, and then we'll get into maybe the opportunity for a deeper conversation. But one of the things that struck me the most, I suppose, when I was reading the text of your talk, was this idea that the smallest hands were, this idea that the whole community was building that structure, that stone structure, and even the smallest hands, the smallest children, literally had a hand in constructing it. And I think that's such an important point, because at the beginning of your talk, you asked people to confront their stereotypes of the caveman, brutish and competitive, but also very male and very white and very, just like heteronormative, all of those sorts of things, all of those stereotypes that we have when we imagine our ancestral landscapes. And of course, it's become a truism, but really we know that children comprised anywhere between 40 to 65% of the population in prehistoric communities. But as I say, when we imagine these landscapes, as you were pointing out at the beginning, we imagine them as being peopled by adults who primarily who hunt, who gather, who fish, who make stone tools, create art, and so on. And in my work and building on others who are working in the archaeology of childhood, I've been trying to emphasize this idea that these adults were also parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles, and they had to make space physically, so very in a literal sense, but also emotionally, intellectually, and cognitively for all of those children around them. And yet we often underplay or think that we can't somehow get at children's contributions in terms of their contributions to the economic, social, and political lives of the people within their larger community. And so I really wasn't surprised. I was delighted, but not surprised when you talked about those tiny stones possibly being brought up by the tiniest hands, because it only makes sense that if children were comprising such a large portion of these communities, that they would also be very active in ensuring that community's success. And your work also made me think a lot about what do we mean by communities, and I think in this idea that community is a more emotionally compelling phrase or term than if we just said population. And I think in most of my earlier work as an archaeologist, to be as objective as possible, I thought, well, I need to use the term population or maybe social organization. And it's only in recent years that I've reframed it to talk about community. And in particular, I was so hesitant in my latest book to talk about families in the Paleolithic, because I don't want to be projecting too much in the past. And yet I think we can use that term in a very broad sense. And Jessica Cooney in 2018 had a great definition of Paleolithic families, where she talked about it as the broader kinship group of the child's immediate community, and would include those who are responsible for its well-being and with whom it shared social values. And that comes back to your definition as well of community, where we have individuals who have shared goals and shared values. And in your work, you also really emphasize the importance of cooperation and support among community members for the overall survival of a people. And I think that's a really important point too, because again, with sort of social Darwinism and so on, this pop culture idea that human evolution was all about survival of the fittest, without people really understanding what's meant by that term. And so to really, again, reframe it to looking at cooperation and support, I think is such an important point that comes out of your work. And I think it's interesting, and I just want to give a brief example here of Neanderthal communities where, there's such a debate in paleoanthropology about how and why Neanderthals went extinct in the Levant, in Europe, and so on. And, out competition, all of these sorts of things, and there's climate change, there's a million different ideas, and there's probably a grain of truth to many of them. I think John Shea explained this one time as the demise of the Neanderthals is kind of a perfect storm of events coming together. But one of the ideas that I've been looking at lately is this idea, building on the work of others here, looking at Neanderthal communities and whether or not they were smaller and less well connected than those of Homo sapiens. And, this is not the place to debate that or not, but just to say that some of the arguments that have been put forth are that Neanderthals, based on the low genetic diversity of at least some of the specimens that have been studied, suggest a smaller group size. And people have kind of put that together with looking at infant mortality and making the argument that caring for large brain infants with significant postnatal growth period within but perhaps without the social network to depend upon that we see with, say, Homo sapiens, where there does seem to be a greater connectivity between communities, and that in a very short period of time, this could lead to the disappearance of Neanderthals as a recognizable population. And so this idea of community as family, community as the larger social structure of interrelated peoples, are both two different ways, but obviously interlinked ways of looking at community. I also, when I study Ice Age children, traditionally we've studied their burials to understand their deaths, but of course we can also look at them. I find that the burials actually tell us a lot about the lives of these kids and teenagers, and also about their relationships to others in their community. And so I wanted to give very briefly two examples of Upper Paleolithic burials that I think speak to this connection of community. And the first one is a 17-year-old male, so a teenager, young man, from the site of Romito in Italy, and who has dwarfism, and it's the oldest documented case that I know of dwarfism in the fossil record. And I guess I have such an affinity. I hate to be too emotional about it, but I have just a feeling for this particular skeleton. I think it's because I have a son who, is around the same age, just turned 20 last week. And so I can picture this teenager here. And he had a number of pathologies that made it so that it was difficult for him to, or would have made it difficult for him to be able to keep up with others in his group when they were going out on hunting parties or for example. But we know a study of his bones suggests that he ate the same meat-rich diet as everyone else in his community. So he was certainly cared for during life. And then when he died, he's been buried in the arms of an older woman that researchers suggest was likely to have been his mom, his mother. And so even though his burial is not particularly rich compared to others that we know of from this time period, there's something about this choice of wrapping this woman's arms around him, if it is his mom, or even if it's not, wrapping some person who meant something to him, wrapping her arms around him. So there's this idea that the community, because it's the community making this decision, right, of how to lay out the bodies, recognizing the relationship between these two individuals, recognizing the relationship between the larger community and the two of them, and then this idea that these relationships continue beyond their mortal lives. And the other example of community that I wanted to touch on briefly is a child burial from La Madeleine. This is a child, we don't actually know the sex of this individual, but I asked an artist, Marina Lescano, to draw a child for me, roughly 2 to 4 years of age. And so this is what she chose. This is who she chose to draw. And what I love about this burial is the number of beads that are associated with it. So there are dentalium beads that have been collected and sawn into highly standardized tiny beads. There are other shell beads that have been collected and teeth and so on. But the perforations are so tiny that it's been suggested that these beads were likely embroidered onto clothing. And the amount of time that it would have taken to collect these shells, standardize their size, and then embroider them onto clothing, let alone all the time that it took to make that clothing itself, which is a whole other discussion, but it's hours and hours of work. And these beads have wear on them to suggest that they were worn during the child's life. But it's not so much, and you might think, oh, maybe they're just leftover from adult clothing, they're passed on to this child. But what we can actually see in this case is that the beads are actually smaller than what we would see with adult burials, or beads associated with adult burials from the same time period. And Kathleen, you had an image from Sangir, and the same thing there. The Sangir kids or adolescents have the same thing. Their beads are about 2/3 the size of the ones with adults. So these are being purposely made for some of the youngest individuals in their community. And when this child died, all of these beads, this clothing was buried, and I'll say her, even though I don't know it was her, buried with her, or buried with this child. And so that's hundreds of hours of time and energy and resources that are taken out of circulation and buried with this child. And so to me, that's another so poignant example of the grief that was likely shown at the passing of this child by, I would say, the larger community. And then finally, I wanted to come back to your point of communities of practice. And I really liked the definition that you've used, where you talk about communities of practice as being a group of people who are connected around a specific activity. They share an understanding of the community's knowledge and beliefs and identity. and that the members of this community of practice, whether it's built on ceramics or textiles or stone tool making or whatever, they have different levels of success and access and status and knowledge, as you say, but that changes over time as people become, as Lav and others have talked about, this idea of being on the periphery and then being more in the core of these communities of practice as they learn through observation, direct teaching, and storytelling, which is what a lot of my current research is looking at right now. And I think, again, so this is another way of thinking about communities that we can really see in the Paleolithic. So when you were talking about the chaîne opératoire and being able to, reconstruct sort of that decision making that people were doing as they were making their stone tools, and this idea that you emphasized about, there are many different ways, that you can make a stone tool, but there are right ways, that cultures consider to be, ways that cultures consider to be right ways of making stone tools. And I think that's the key, that you've brought out here. And so this idea of situated learning or the social context of learning, and we have a number of sites in the Upper Paleolithic where people have taken these forensic approaches, like the researchers at Sylvia, for instance, have taken forensic approaches of being able to look at apprenticeship in learning. So we have an example of a novice on, the periphery of a site, trying to make a stone tool, hitting some kind of problem, bringing that core to the center of the site, getting some expert help, because you see all of a sudden the mingling of flakes of the novice and the expert together, and then this tool is carried back, core is carried back to the periphery again, where the novice continues working. And quite often you see that the novice materials are left behind because they're mostly for practice, and whereas the expertly made tools are often taken away for some kind of purpose. And so, there's such a beautiful way of being able to see community and the social context of learning. And, there's a number of different ways that we can do that through looking at things that tell us that we're looking at a novice, such as very typical novice errors and the quality of raw material. And sometimes they get, the lower quality material to practice on, and that kind of thing. So there's all different ways that we can try and see them in the archaeological record. And so again, this comes back to this idea of community and what it means in this time period. There are all different levels at which we can be thinking about community, but what really unites them is, again, this idea of cooperation, of mutual trust, of caring, of, both in life and, as we can see, also in death. And so just to kind of wrap up, one of the questions that I wanted to, I have a million questions, but one of the questions that I wanted to turn over to you, Kathleen, after thinking about all of this, was when I was looking at reading about that built structure, and then finally getting to see the slides that you showed of it, and it's spectacular. It really brought to mind some of the work that Meg Conkey and Lisa Mahar have done, and I'm sure you know their article from a couple of years ago called "Homes for Hunters," where they look at this idea, like as you said at the beginning of your talk, when you use a house, or shelter is kind of an objective way, but when you use using that term, but when you say home, that brings up all these connotations of family and connection to place and memory, and their argument was that we don't have, people have generally thought we don't have a home. We don't, and again, community would be part of that, but we don't have a home, we don't have a community until you get agriculture, until the Neolithic Revolution, and then people had homes. And their whole argument is actually no, hunters, foraging people had homes. And I'm wondering what you think about that idea in relation to the built structure and other examples of community that you see at your site. And I'll stop sharing my slides now here.
Yes, it's one of the examples, of course, that was used in this paper by Conky and Marv was of Peyro Blanc.
Yeah.
So, this idea of people who are mobile, having places that they think of as home, that they call home, shouldn't be so strange to us. Certainly there are plenty of people nowadays who have more than one place that they think of as home, or it's not just a building that they think of as being home, but a broader place. And I think the danger, if we don't think about hunter-gatherers as having places that they think of as home, is detaching them from the landscape, detaching them from places, and presenting this idea that it was not important to them, that they didn't find and make meaning through place, and that there weren't places that they belonged. They could just go anywhere, and anybody could go anywhere, which doesn't sound like a great way to interact with friends or foes. That the landscape is important to us now, places are important to us now, why would it be any different? And, are the homes, the supposed homes of these farmers, what makes them more homey than the caves, for example, which are about as permanent a structure as people lived in, or something that they built in the landscape and took with them from place to place? Why is that less of a home? Unless we don't want to consider any sort of emotional investment in place in the past.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's that idea of, again, we don't want to bring emotion into it, and I think you're absolutely right. But it does a disservice, I think, to the research. And I think, just to kind of build on what you were saying, I mean, and we have evidence in the archaeological record of people coming back again and again to the same places. We have layers upon layers of hearth structures, for instance, or in some of the cave art. I mean, some cave art looks like people were there for a short period of time and that was that. But we have other examples where you have calcite developing over the art. So, and then people coming back and refreshing those lines. So clearly, there is that connection to place. It's very clear in the archaeological record, and yet we're so afraid to use the term home when it comes to that. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
And besides the examples we have of people refreshing images, we also have some examples of people effacing the images.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, staking a claim on that place for themselves.
Yeah, that's actually such a good point. And it's, it's the exact opposite of, way, in the sense of, saying, okay, now we're here, and absolutely staking a claim. So yeah, that's a great point.
I loved the images you used. Of course, I chose one of the same ones, and we didn't consult ahead of time on our slideshow.
No.
But,
well, it just shows we're in tune, right?
Yes,
so,
yes.
That's a good thing. Anyways, maybe we should let it, I don't know if we want to have other people ask you questions. I don't want to monopolize you. I'll do that later.
Sure. Does anybody have questions for our speakers tonight? Feel free to type them in the chat or to unmute. John, I see your hand.
Your Kathleen, your description of this structure put me in mind of something my grandmother said to me kind of way back in the Paleolithic. Never come home with your hands empty. It doesn't matter, a couple of sticks, a piece of wood for the fire, never come home with your hands empty. So this idea that children are separate from, the work environment, from daily life, this is a real late industrial thing that we drag back into the past, and it has absolutely no support whatsoever in ethnography of either hunter-gatherers, pastoralists, farmers, or what have you. I mean, if you look about farmers, children are helpers at the nest. They subsidize their parents' reproductive activities. So this idea that children are a separate caste that sit around twiddling their thumbs doing nothing, it's just ridiculous nonsense. It's something that I hope your research will correct. Nice talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I completely agree with what you're saying. Children were not just a drain, as we might think they were, but they were productive, they were helpful, and all the while they were learning and playing.
Yeah, I think that idea that that kids don't contribute really, it's not true today. And I think it was never true in the past, no matter what time or period we're looking at. But I think often, especially sort of in the industrialized West, we have this idealized idea of what childhood should be rather than what childhood actually is, and probably, it never has been this idealized thing that we'd like it to be, perhaps. Any other questions that people have?
I have a comment, Peter Kleckner, that a couple of comments actually. I'm not an archaeologist, I'm an ethnologist, and I have worked with hunters and hunter horticulturalists, but I've also a lot of friends who've either worked in the Kalahari or with hunter-gatherers. And one thing that crops up there is that even though, and this is on different continents, even though hunter-gatherers are highly mobile, they do have a sort of central home base to which they return to at some point of the year, or very often do. And there's a time when they all come together and they have ceremonies and exchanges and they arrange marriages, but they also have their particular home base. So that might be quite ancient. And then from my work with the Hibero and Achua in the upper Amazon, who are hunter horticulturists, neonatal death was quite high, as was maternal death in childbirth. But when the children survived, they were very sturdy, very healthy, and very vigorous. Unfortunately, of course, if there were people who were deformed in any way or mentally retarded, I was very surprised to find that these people were considered sacred. And they were deeply cherished and afforded a lot of attention and respect. Now, there was one woman who had a bifida, her knees were bent and she couldn't walk. So she mobilized on her knees. Otherwise, she was highly intelligent. And she had the sacred task of treating snakebite, which she did by taking yucca, the manioc, and dipping it in water and sprinkling it on the bite. That reduced the circulation and stopped the venom from circulating. And there were other things that she applied. But it seems these people often command great respect. And this was brought to my attention once by an MD who had noticed he visited museums, and he had noticed there were often there were renderings of people who were not quite normal. And he asked me about that. Now, I had art volumes of people who were handicapped in one way and another, both in South America and in Africa. And in both instances, these people appeared to be venerated. So I mentioned that as a possibility of when you had the dwarf, and who seemed to be, obviously he'd survived, even though he wasn't normally mobile. He had to be cared for when he was a child and maintained in the community, as you pointed out. So this maybe is part of our heritage. I guess they're unconnected, but I thought it might be pertinent to your studies.
Yeah, sorry, Kathleen, do you want to?
No, I was going to say that you could speak about some of these burials that we have in the Paleolithic.
Yeah, just to say kind of briefly, but yeah, definitely it's really interesting looking at the burials from the Gravettian and Epigravettian. So around, depending on the dates that you accept, I'm gonna upset somebody with my dates, but anywhere between 25 and 35,000 years ago. I'm just going to say 25. But anyways, a lot of these burials, though, we don't have a lot of them. So we only have about, say 100 individuals or so in really sort of good burial contexts. But what's really interesting is that so many of them, at least a third of the adults and a third, and right now I'm working with Jenny French and Mary Lewis on looking at the teens and children in these burials. But what we've been finding, which is, what others have remarked on as well, that, a good third of those individuals have some kind of pathology and usually multiple pathologies. And so, which suggest, and then others have died violent deaths, and which has prompted some people to talk about these burials as being associated with people who've had bad deaths in some way. And so either this violent death or that the pathologies that they were able to make it through earlier childhood with, suddenly became more of an obstacle as they reached sexual maturation and so on, when that sort of social scaffolding started to fall away a bit more. But it's really interesting because oftentimes we would talk about these burials as being, indicators of social status or whatever. And what we find is actually there's more variation, regional variation in these burials than there is any internal variation. So it's not necessarily reflecting status. And a lot of these burials, the double and triple burials, like at Donle Bestinici and others, where there's this elaborate tableau that's being played out. There's some story, some drama. And again, the community has gotten together and decided to lay these bodies out in particular ways where often there are two people looking at each other and a third one, that's kind of disengaged in some way. And so, yeah, they tell us definitely about, the care of these individuals to get them to the, for at least a good portion of their lives. But then there's something really interesting and quite bizarre in some ways that's going on with them as well. So, we have such a small number of burials for the thousands of years time period that we're looking at. But everyone is really, or almost all of them are quite interesting for that kind of story that they're telling. So.
John, I see your hand, but we have a question from Shannon in the chat that for Kathleen. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering about the adhesive material found during excavations. What materials is it made from, and how does it fit into the local, non-local dynamic?
Well, we're not sure yet what it's made of. It looks like it's probably some sort of tree sap at its base, and there would have been pine trees during this time, so that would be consistent. It's something that we need to get analyzed, and it's a very glassy lump. There are a couple of these lumps in this area, and it's interesting that it's near the pieces of antler that have been worked, especially the one that has a groove, because there are only a few examples of this, but sometimes small pieces of stone were inserted into worked or grooved pieces of antler, and they might have been doing that right at that spot. You know, we see in another part of the site where you can, it's like, you know, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where somebody just left all of their flint knapping in one place as if they planned to come back, but they never did. As far as the local, non-local, I don't know yet. It might not fit into that narrative, but we do see examples of these composite tools in a lot of places.
I was wondering, with that child that was buried with that very elaborate clothing, was that an unusual thing? Is that fairly common, that all of that work with child burials?
So we don't have a lot of child burials from the Upper Paleolithic. And not all of them certainly have that kind of degree of elaborateness to them. But at the same time, it's not completely unusual. The Sungir burial that Kathleen was showing, I think you showed the adult from that one, right? There are two kids buried head to head, two boys. And we know that they're male from the ancient DNA studies, and they have thousands of mammoth ivory beads associated with them, and again, you know, standardized, smaller than what you would see with the adult. They also have you know, other kind. They have tools with them. They have little sculptures. They even have, there's a femur, so a thigh bone that's been broken, and it belongs to someone they think from somewhere else, another community, and it's been stuffed with ochre, which is also quite interesting. So there's all kinds of, you know, so it's not typical, but it's also not unusual. There, you know, even there is some infants from Kremsbachberg in Austria, where you have twins, and again, twin boys, we know through ancient DNA, they're boys. And even these ones who only lived, like, I think the first one died at about a month after being born full term, and the other one about 3 months after or something. And they reopened the burial and put the brother in with the original boy. And their male cousin is also buried nearby. And even though they only lived for a very short period of time, they're also associated with a few beads and ochre. One of them is thought to be wrapped in a shroud because the ochre is so delimited, and there's a little mammoth ivory pin that's remaining. But in those cases, which is kind of interesting, is that there's no wear on the beads associated with the infants. So they were either made purposely for the burial, or they were made for them to wear in life, but they never got a chance to. So,
but there's no indication that it could be some kind of social differentiation.
We don't really, yeah, you know, the problem is that there's so few burials, you know, so we make the most out of, you know, in the Paleolithic, like 2 is a series. So we make the most out of what we have. And so so people like Francesco D'Errico and Marion Van Aaron and others who've looked at a lot of these burials and Julian Riel Salvatore and others have looked at these and come to the same conclusion that I and my colleagues have, that there's more difference between regions than within the burials. Like we just we have a paper in press right now looking at Gravenian children. Actually, we're looking at teens, so what we're describing is adolescents in a very broad sense. And we've been comparing their burials with adults and younger children. And there are some things that set them apart, which are kind of interesting, but then there's a lot that connect them. And there does seem to be more difference, say, between the burials coming from Western Europe and the ones, say, in Central and Eastern Europe. So it does seem to be a regional variation. So it's not to say that there wasn't social status. A lot of people make the argument because of there may be craft specialization and so on. But you know, it's not always so clear cut with the burial data itself.
Yeah.
Okay, by the way, thanks to the two of you. Both of you were really great. Really enjoyed the talk.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Graeber and Windman in their recent book, they call these things princely burials, which I think expresses a sentiment. These are not typical. These are not the mode. These are not the central tendency. These are, you know, like the burials of you know, the royalty. You're not looking at the average. You're looking at the extreme. But the notion of using children, and more to the point, children burials as social statements, this is deeply ancestral. You know, Kafsa Cave in Israel, outside of Nazareth, they've got one kid they buried who had hydrocephalus. This kid would have been profoundly retarded. I mean, just like useless in terms of subsistence. Another one got clipped by something in his frontal bone, a penetrated wound, which healed over. That would have obviously caused an infection. He would have been basically nuts for you know his adolescence. And they kept these guys alive for some reason or another. This isn't something that just evolved, you know, when people ran out of places to live and they moved into Europe. This is something that's probably ancestral Africans did it, First Asians did it. It's part of our ancestral pattern of behavior, of using the you know both supporting individuals who are, especially children who are profoundly disabled, as well as using their bodies as statements. You know, I don't know how far back it goes, whether it's a shared feature with Neanderthals, but it's worth exploring. You know, that notion, which I guess you do, April, in your forthcoming book, and I suspect you, Kathleen, will be doing in your analysis of these sites. You know, children are the invisible people. And,
Absolutely, but
they create
sorry.
a indestructible archaeological record. So there you have it.
And I agree with what you're saying, but in some ways, but I really have trouble with the term princely burial, because I really do think that each of these burials is so unique in so many ways, but they don't all have the copious numbers of beads and I think they're unusual for some reason, but the term princely bothers me in the sense that it does suggest that we're talking about royalty or high status people only, and I'm not sure that's borne out by the burials themselves, in the sense that we do have these connections between, you know, anyways, that we see, as I say, more regional difference, but I do agree with you absolutely that there's a small number of burials, and for that reason alone, there's something really interesting going on. And again, with the ones from Barma Grande and the ones from Dolneva Sinici and other places where you've got this tableau, this laying out of the corpses in a way, you know, to suggest some kind of theater, some kind of story. I think that there is something really unusual going on with them, for sure. But I don't know that they're always the highest status individuals. I think it might be more nuanced than that. But
Thank you both. I must go. Have a nice evening. I appreciate it.
nice to see you again, John. Take care.
Yeah, I would add that we have a very skewed sample that's certainly in Western Europe, where the focus has been on excavating caves. Most of the burials, if not all of them, are in caves, because that's the only place we've ever looked for them.
Absolutely.
And then in Central and Eastern Europe, where caves are less frequent, we have these open air burials. And I think there's a lot more diversity in those burials, from ones that have a lot of grave goods to ones that don't, singles, multiples, different ages. And at least in Western Europe, if we looked in broader context, if we were able to find broader contexts for burials, that we would see a lot more diversity. But that what we're seeing is care, the other part of the theme.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both so much. I think we have about 1 minute left. There are a lot of great comments in the chat. I don't know if Kathleen or April, if you want to have a last word, respond to anything that we see here. This is great. Just pulling it straight back to care, which is our theme that Stephanie started out with. This has been wonderful. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for having us. It's been so much fun. I really enjoyed this.
Yes, it's been delightful.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, April and Kathleen. This was a fabulous discussion. I learned so much, and we delight in bringing together our amazing community of anthropologists across our 4 fields for these kinds of engaging, lively, maybe even controversial conversations about research and everything that's going on. And we are so pleased to have been able to bring you both together with us tonight. We wish you were here in New York. We would go out and have some dinner and dessert and drinks together, and we could continue talking. But we'll have to take a rain check, although we hope to meet you all in person before long. So thank you so much for joining us tonight for this fascinating discussion of patterns of care in Ice Age families and communities. Thanks to everyone for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you all back to our final lecture of the academic year on May 16th, also on Zoom, also starting at 6:30 p.m., for a lecture by Professor Marav Shohet. She will present a paper entitled Silence and Sacrifice, Narrative, Emergent Care, and Community in Context, and will be joined in conversation by Joao Biel. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.